Welcome to What Is It About the Weather? Where once a week we get together and explore the many ways that weather intertwines itself into our lives. I'm your host, Mark Jelinek, and this week it's time to get back to that favorite topic of ours, weather and history. But before I do that, as always, let me take a moment to say thank you to all of you taking the time to support the podcast. Now, some of you have been throwing a bit of coinage via Patreon or PayPal. Others have been letting friends know about the podcast, posting reviews, tweeting, whatever it might be. Still others have been sending show ideas, feedback, questions, whatever it might be. All those things are important to the evolution of the podcast, the quality of the podcast, and generally just helping out all the way around. So thank you for doing that. I hope you're having good weather. And I'm in that time of year where we have some days I don't like, starting to get a little warm. I don't know. Too early to tell what the whole summer is going to be like for me. But you guys know, I'm not a big fan of the hot weather. I don't know. I guess I'd look at it differently if I felt it was easy to escape without shoving yourself into an air-conditioned location, which is kind of what you have to do here in the South. I grew up in it. I understand it. Adapt to it. But generally speaking, it's not my favorite thing to do. So instead of listening to me whine about the weather and the way it's intertwining itself into my life right now, why don't we get to weather and history? Now, the past times that we've done this, and we've been doing this about once a quarter, right? We go and we find a historic topic. And traditionally, we've been looking at things that are more global impact-wise in nature. Not necessarily that it was some large-scale, global-scale event, per se, weather event, but generally speaking that the event itself had the potential to trigger something on a global scale, or something for all of mankind, maybe, is a way to think about it. Or, and sometimes that could just be a key region in a given age. A specific period in the history of Asia or North America or Europe, whatever it was, right? Because sometimes different regions have been more prominent throughout the course of history. Not a big surprise there. So some of it's been about the timing as much as it has been about the magnitude of the event, because even small events can have a big consequence. But really, if you step back and think about it for a moment, just a moment, you go, well, there's a likelihood somewhere today, right? If you stop and you look at the weather going on around the globe, that lives are being changed by the weather. Now, some of those events may be so small in scale that they miss the vast majority of us. But likely, somewhere somebody's being impacted by, it could be severe weather, or it could be something even seemingly less severe, but big enough to alter a course home, or causes an accident, right? It doesn't have to be a major thing. And lives might forever be altered. Now, it doesn't always have to be a bad thing either. And I think that's important to keep in mind with this. A lot of times, and we don't think about this, and these are not the things that end up in history books either, and so we're not going to go too deep down this path today. But sometimes, weather is changing things for the good. As an example, maybe rain has arrived in an area that's been experiencing a drought, or just, the relief from a heat wave, right? Some cool air finally came into a region. Or at an individual level, maybe the perfect weather showed up for a wedding or graduation or some other event that maybe by it being just the right type of weather, makes it more meaningful for an individual or a small set of individuals. And that day becomes of special significance in their life going forward, more so than it would have been otherwise. And they still look back fondly on the weather that presented itself. Now, given that can happen, there's also this in-between zone. Because again, how are you going to go into a podcast episode about somebody's life unless you've talked to those individuals? And I guess we could do that. That would be kind of an interesting idea. Has weather ever impacted your life? Maybe something to keep in mind for the future. But somewhere between that global scale and that individual scale, there are lots of what have been large-scale weather events that have been very meaningful for a country, for a region, for changing a part of history, maybe an industry or a sector that, depending on how you look at it, somehow those things have been changed because of a sequence of events where weather was involved. So I thought what we would do today is look at a couple of those. And again, we'll see where this goes. Maybe down the road this can become more of a regular thing, because these stories are, they're major stories, but you may have never heard of them. Some of these other ones, they may have been new to you, but some of them you'd likely heard before, or at least heard mentioned before. But we're going to cover two, and interestingly enough, they both are focused on a single state here in the U.S., state of Texas. And I'm going to cover them because they were sent in as suggestions. Now, the first one was sent in by the person who actually came up with the idea of doing weather in history, Jack, who is an old friend of mine from growing up, who put forward some of the original ones that we covered. Mentioned in a follow-on exchange with me, covering some of these smaller events. And one of them was the Galveston hurricane. Now, many of you, again, if you're not from the U.S., Galveston may not mean anything to you. Or even if you are from the U.S., and even if you know where Texas is, you may not know where Galveston is. A lot of us get absorbed into our lives. There are a lot of places around the country I live in that I wouldn't necessarily know at first mention. So let me set the stage. Galveston is a coastal community in Texas. There. See, that was easy enough. So proximity-wise, for those of you who maybe know some bigger cities, Houston is what it's close to, right? But back in the day, Galveston was pretty important, and Texas was pretty important. Texas still is a major part of the U.S. economy, for sure. One of the most populous states in the country. But back in the day, it was kind of a hub for a lot of things. You got to remember, and it's been a lot of history, right? A lot of even U.S. history. Shares a border with Mexico. Borders on the Gulf of Mexico as well. Oil, big in Houston and across Texas. Other crops as well. But as you can imagine, back in the day, let's say early 1900s, if you wanted those things to move somewhere, railroad was starting to come around, and that was a piece of the equation. But also ships. So a port was a big deal. And back around the time of 1900, Galveston was a fairly large port, right? Clearly a very different time, right? No internet, no television. Railroad, yes. Telegraph, yes. But this area, Galveston, I think at the time, if I'm remembering correctly, it was kind of battling with Houston. Houston at that point in time, today it's thought of as a big port, but back then it wasn't. Galveston had a nice channel for ships, could get in. In Houston, if for those that don't know the area, I mean, Houston the port was built. I mean, it's a better way to think about it. And we've seen more of that. But Galveston was essentially poised to become the place in that region. Now, we come to find out that the discovery of oil near Houston and things like that might have shaped and changed things. But there was other challenges that it faced. 1900, the tallest point on the island was less than 3 meters, less than 9 feet. And this had not gone unnoticed, as other storms had hit other coastal communities. But there was also this kind of belief, as with all things, well, it's not going to get us. It's not going to happen for a long time. But that was not to be the case. So in the midst of hurricane season, right? Hurricane season doing its thing, 1900, a storm would impact Cuba early September. And when it left the island of Cuba, it tracked kind of along Cuba. And we've seen this. Hurricane Ike is another classic example, which also ended up over in the same vicinity. It's an eerily similar path. But when it came out, there was competing opinions as to what was going to happen with this hurricane. The forecasters in Cuba at the time actually thought there was a real concern for this storm heading towards the western Gulf of Mexico, which is where it went, although the U.S. Weather Bureau felt it was going to turn to the north. And actually the shape that it took as it was leaving Cuba initially seemed to give that impression as well. But it ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. And the other thing you got to keep in mind is back then, right, weren't looking at satellites, right? Didn't have all these great tools and instruments, even buoys in the ocean or anything. You had to count on ships when things were out in the open ocean. You just weren't that lucky. So this thing started heading west to the Gulf of Mexico. And with little warning, I'm not going to say no warning, there was a recognition that it was headed west, and there was signs on the horizon that it was coming. But with little warning, it would ultimately make landfall right at Galveston. Now, at the time, it was Category 4 by, North Atlantic hurricane standards. I know those things don't always equate, but what we call a major hurricane. It's a very powerful storm. Again, keep in mind the island was at its tallest under 10 feet, under 3 meters. And essentially obliterated this island that had tens of thousands of people living on it. Okay. Again, we didn't have all the sophistication we have today, but it would become the deadliest natural event, natural disaster in U.S. history, still to this day. With an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 dead. We're never going to probably get an exact number, but as you can imagine, if a whole island is covered in water, I mean, even if you got a tall building, and even if the building survives the event, the strong winds, that's no easy task to survive that thing. People did. Lots of people did. But it was devastating. Again, still the worst natural disaster in U.S. history. The interesting thing is they did try to come back from it. They did a couple things. They built a seawall, which another hurricane would top the seawall again. But they went through this process of raising the island in kind of an interesting way, that they used kind of this combination of water and sand. They kind of pumped things up under the buildings and then let the water go away, and you were left with this sand sort of thing. And they did a lot of that. But what was a major city at the time? I mean, it's the best way to think about it. I know. You don't think tens of thousands of people as being a major city. But in 1900, for where it was and what it was, that was a pretty impressive location. And it would never fully recover from that. Other events came into play, but it's likely that they would have battled some still for that dominance. Even if it shifted over time, it likely would not have happened in the manner that it happened. Did it change global events? Did it mean that crops didn't go to port and things didn't get sent? No, it didn't mean that. That's what I'm saying. It didn't necessarily change the global impact of things. But for it still to be the most devastating in terms of loss of life events in U.S. history, and for that region in particular, it would forever reshape what happened in that region. So the second one also involves Texas. And this one was suggested by Mike. And he sent it to me a while back, way, long time ago. And he brought it up because it happened on the day he was born. And it involved a tornado, famous tornado called the Waco tornado of 1953. Mother's Day weekend, right? It's kind of prominent right now, so it, kind of a big deal. And all you mothers out there, I hope you had a good Mother's Day, because this one, was probably good for a lot of people. But the following Monday in Waco, and there had been some over the course of that weekend, it was just kind of a rough weekend in general. A lot of storms, a lot of tornadoes. It was a very high tornado year in general. So instead of it being a time of celebration, it was this area of storms. And we see that. It is a time of year where we kind of tend to see these sort of outbreaks. But I wanted to cover this one not because of the devastation, but to remind people that there can be silver linings and things. Over 100 people lost their life. And again, this was one tornado amongst many over that weekend. So there was I don't remember the final count in my head, but there were hundreds of people in the collective storms that broke out that lost their lives. But something would show up on the radar in that tornado, along with two others that year. One actually happened about a month before, and one about a month after, that were the first ever recorded radar images that showed what has probably been the most important discovery in terms of forecasting and evolving the warning systems related to tornadoes. And that's what we call the hook echo. And it's called that just because it looks like a hook, and the echo is because, that's what's coming back on a radar screen. Don't overthink it. But it's anybody who's ever looked at tornado stuff knows that it's a signature within the radar. And again, what was really neat about this is these were early radars, remember. This is not the newest Doppler radar or dipole or any of these other things that you've heard me mention before. This was early radar that really wasn't, refined, if you will, with the technologies we have today that really help us in the weather processes of using these devices. This is still where we were making that transition from this is more of a military instrument to this can be something of use in weather. So it was very early days. But it was 1953 where these confirmed sightings were actually physically recorded, and it would begin the process in our understanding of what does a tornado look like on a radar, or at least what it can look like when you've got a big bad tornado like this one was. Very powerful tornado, winds over 250 miles an hour. Would it forever shape and change Waco, Texas? You betcha. Forever. I mean, these things are, whether it's like the Galveston thing or this may not have destroyed as many buildings, may not have taken as many lives, but it's still a powerful event that reshaped, in this case, a specific city, in some ways forever, right? In some lives forever. But thankfully, we were able to take something out of this devastation and this tragedy, along with some others that had occurred, and incorporate them into our understanding of these events, particularly these powerful events, and become more effective in our ability to keep people out of harm's way when they happen. And they're going to keep happening, folks. We're always going to have severe weather. It's not going anywhere. At least I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think we're ever going to get that good at weather modification. But it is that reminder that in the sequence of life, right, at all times, that sometimes, there's an opportunity for good to rise up from tragedy. And it happens in the weather world too. It does all the time. Whether it's improved research or stories of heroism in devastating situations. And it's important for us to find those things and to look to those things as we move forward, because the tragedies can become overwhelming at times, and we don't want them to be that way for us collectively. So a couple history events. Impactful? Sure. Change history? Sure. Just like weather does every day. You may never have heard of either, and that may not have reshaped your life, but it had real impacts. You know, it's interesting. I was reminded actually of a story when I was doing the research, particularly on the Waco, Texas thing, that it used to be kind of against the rules to mention the word tornado or try to even forecast tornadoes, you know, because it was tricky, right? Back in the day, we didn't understand a lot about them or how to forecast them, and there was fear that it would cause more panic than it would be helpful to mention them in a forecast. But effectively in 1950, it finally became okay to mention them again. There had apparently been, and that's the thing, I couldn't find the specific banning of it. My guess is it may have been at a location by location or base by base cases. But there was an official memo released on July 12th of 1950 that said it was okay to bring these things up again. It's kind of hard to believe. I mean, you know, just not too long ago, how little we knew about so many things. Tornadoes being one of them. And the dance we played, and we do it today all the time, right? It's like, where's that right balance between too much information, not enough? You know, you don't want too much herd mentality driving dangerous behaviors. And I still see them all the time. I mean, I see stories of people still doing things that we taught years ago about how to live out a tornado under an overpass or something, which we now know just you shouldn't do, actually put you in more danger. Hopefully someday we'll get there. With so many things, we continue to make the steps. Who knows? Who knows? Well, I hope you've enjoyed these kind of smaller tidbit ones of weather and history. Maybe you learned a little something you didn't know. Maybe you think about weather and history a little differently, maybe on your level. You know, I had that other paper that I mentioned, I think it was in the last episode, maybe the one or two before that, where I was talking about how people's past histories, I think it was a couple ago, shape how they respond in the future to severe weather and how they act and don't act, and how sometimes we hit a tipping point, I think. And these are more examples that I'm sure that the people that were impacted directly by this, it forever shaped how they did it and maybe how they influenced those around them in terms of how they responded. But as you go around today, right, as you're listening to the episode, maybe stop. Don't stop. Not when you're listening to the episode, when it's safe to stop. Don't just stop in the middle of the road or anything. But at some point when it's safe, stop and think about, what were you doing today at some point where the weather may have had a direct impact? Will it be meaningful? Will it be a good memory? Whatever it is. It's a good reminder to keep these things kind of in our focus when we look about the way our lives are shaped. From day to day, year to year, or even minute to minute. Because as we all know, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.
There's your two white sofa production.
We're tired of hearing our uncle grovel, so please support him on patreon.com/weather.